My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 37 years old. And 3 years ago, I found out that according to my family, I had been dead since 2021. I need to tell you how that happens, because I think most people hear something like that and imagine a dramatic disappearance, a missing persons case, a body that was never found. The reality was considerably more ordinary and considerably more deliberate. I left my family in August of 2021. Not with a scene or a confrontation or a final breaking point that would make a clean story. I left the way people leave situations that have been slowly suffocating them for years, quietly, completely, and without leaving a forwarding address. My marriage to Derek had ended 18 months earlier, in a divorce that was legally clean and personally devastating in the way of ending something you had believed in. My family, my mother Carol, my brother Marcus, and my Aunt Diane, who had always functioned as a third parent, had sided with Derek in ways I had not fully anticipated. Not aggressively, but consistently. They had believed his version of events. They had maintained their relationship with him after the divorce. They had, over the 18 months that followed, made me feel, in the particular quiet way that family can make you feel things, that I was the problem in a situation where I had not been the problem. I moved to Portland. I got a small apartment, a new job in medical billing, a new life that was entirely mine to construct from scratch. I changed my phone number. I deactivated my social media. I did not, at any point, formally notify my family that I was cutting contact. I simply stopped being reachable, which amounted to the same thing. I assumed they would eventually reach the conclusion that I didn't want to be found. I did not assume they would reach any other conclusion. I lived in Portland for 2 years without incident. I made friends slowly. I rebuilt myself even more slowly. I did not think about my family often, and when I did, it was with the particular exhaustion of someone who has decided that the energy required to maintain a painful relationship exceeds the energy required to exist without it. What changed was a phone call in October of 2023. The caller identified herself as an investigator with a life insurance company based in Illinois. She said she was conducting a review of a claim that had been paid out on a policy. I told her I didn't have a life insurance policy. She said the policy had been taken out in 2018, with my mother listed as the primary beneficiary. I had known vaguely that my mother had taken out a small life insurance policy on me years earlier, the kind of thing parents sometimes did when their children were young adults, a modest policy that had never registered as significant in my mind. I had been listed as the insured. My mother had been the beneficiary. I had not thought about it in years. The investigator told me the policy had paid out in full following a claim submitted in February of 2022, approximately 6 months after I had stopped contact with my family. She told me the claim had been submitted with a death certificate. I sat down on the floor of my apartment. A death certificate. I asked her to describe it. She said it listed the cause of death as injuries sustained in a motor vehicle accident. It listed the date of death as November 14, 2021, approximately 3 months after I had left. I told her I was alive. She said she was beginning to understand that. I want to describe the weeks that followed carefully, because they moved quickly and required a level of clear-headedness that I was not certain I possessed in the immediate aftermath of that phone call. The investigator's name was Helen Park, and she turned out to be exactly the person I needed in those first weeks: methodical, calm, experienced with fraud cases, and absolutely clear about what the documentation in front of her meant. She had been reviewing the claim as part of a routine audit of large payouts, not because anything had specifically flagged it. The policy had paid out $280,000. $280,000. My mother had collected $280,000 on a fraudulent death certificate filed 3 months after I had simply stopped calling. Helen explained the situation to me with the particular precision of someone who has learned to deliver extraordinary information in ordinary language. She said that the death certificate had been filed with the county in a state where I had briefly lived before moving to Portland, which had delayed the cross-referencing that might have flagged. She said the insurance claim had been processed without the additional verification that larger payouts sometimes triggered, because the certificate had appeared legitimate on initial review. She said the fraud had gone undetected for nearly 2 years. She asked me if I had any idea who might have filed the certificate. I told her I had several ideas. The first call I made after hanging up with Helen was to an attorney named David Cho in Portland, who had been recommended to me by a colleague who had gone through a fraud case of a different kind. I explained the situation to David in as much detail as I had, which was not much yet. He told me to document everything I had been told, to gather every piece of identifying documentation that established my existence and location during the period following November 2021, and to come to his office the following morning. I spent that evening pulling together everything I had. My lease, signed in September 2021. My employment records from the medical billing company, starting October 2021. My Oregon driver's license, issued November 2021, 3 days before the date of my supposed death. My tax returns for 2021 and 2022. My bank statements showing continuous activity from August 2021 to the present. A person who dies in a car accident on November 14th does not apply for an Oregon driver's license on November 11th. David looked at the documentation and said we had everything we needed to establish my existence and to support a criminal referral to the state attorney general's office and the federal authorities, given that insurance fraud involving a fraudulent death certificate crossed into federal jurisdiction. I asked him what he thought would happen to my family. He told me plainly that what had been done constituted insurance fraud, filing a false government document, and obtaining money under false pretenses, federal charges, all of them, carrying significant potential sentences. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I needed a day. I spent that day doing something I had not done in over 2 years. I looked at photographs of my family. Not out of sentimentality, not out of any impulse toward reconciliation, but because I needed to understand before I made any decision who these people were to me now, what they had been before, what they had become in those 3 months between my disappearance and the filing of a fraudulent death certificate. My mother was 63 years old. She had raised Marcus and me alone after my father left when I was 8. She was not, by any ordinary measure, a criminal. She was a frightened, controlling woman who had spent her life managing the people around her through the particular alchemy of guilt and love, and who had responded to my disappearance. I now understood, not with grief, but with a practical problem that required a practical solution. The practical solution had apparently been a death certificate. What I could not determine, sitting with photographs, was who had arranged it. My mother did not have the knowledge or the connections to file a fraudulent government document. Marcus was smarter and more calculating. Aunt Diane had worked for years in healthcare administration, which would have given her familiarity with medical documentation processes. I returned to David's office the next morning and told him I was proceeding. The federal investigation was open within 2 weeks of my formal statement to the FBI's financial crimes. Helen Park's documentation from the insurance company formed the foundation. My own records established my survival. What the investigators needed to build was the chain, who had obtained the fraudulent death certificate, how, from whom, and with whose knowledge. That investigation took 7 months. I was not privy to most of it while it was ongoing. What I learned came in pieces, through David, as the investigators shared information they were permitted to share. The death certificate had been obtained through a notary in the county where I had briefly lived, a man who had a history of providing fraudulent documentation for payment. He had been arrested on an unrelated matter 2 years earlier and had since become a cooperating witness in several fraud investigations. When the investigators approached him with the documentation from my case, he identified Marcus from a photograph. Marcus had paid for the certificate. He had provided the information it contained, my name, my date of birth, the details of a fictional car accident on a fictional date. He had delivered it to my mother, who had submitted the insurance claim. My Aunt Diane had known, she had not initiated it. But she had known and she had said nothing, and she had accepted a portion of the payout, $40,000, transferred to her account 11 months after the claim was paid. My mother was charged with insurance. Marcus was charged with procurement of a fraudulent government document, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and wire fraud. Diane was charged with receiving stolen property and conspiracy. All 3 accepted plea agreements. My mother received probation and full restitution. She was 63 years old with no prior record, and the court took into account that she had not been the architect of the scheme. She was also required to complete 2 years. Marcus received 18 months in federal custody, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and was ordered to pay full restitution. Diane received probation and restitution. The $280,000 was clawed back by the insurance company through the restitution orders. I received nothing from it directly. That was not, in any case, what I had been looking for. What I had been looking for was something I find difficult to name precisely. Not revenge, not closure in the therapeutic sense of a thing that resolves cleanly and stays resolved. Something more like acknowledgement, the formal, legal, documented acknowledgement that what my family had done was real, that it had happened, that it was wrong, and that I had not imagined the kind of people they were capable of being. The plea agreements provided that acknowledgement. I have not spoken to my mother Marcus or Diane since the investigation began. I think about the November that they filed that certificate. The meetings they must have had, the conversations, the decisions made about how to describe a car accident that hadn't happened, about what date to put on a document that would make me officially, legally, governmentally dead. I think about the fact that Marcus had known me for 37 years, had grown up in the same house, had called me his sister at occasions that required the word. And I think about what it means that none of those things had been enough. I am not angry in the way people expect me to be. The anger was there, in the weeks after Helen's phone call, in the days before I decided to proceed. It has settled over the months since into something quieter and more permanent, kind of knowledge about what people are capable of that I carry with me, and that has made me more careful, and I think more honest about the limits of what family means. I have a good job and a small apartment and friends who know my actual name and my actual history. I have a driver's license issued 3 days before my supposed death that I keep in my wallet as the most useful piece of documentation I have ever owned. I am 37 years old. According to a document filed in a county courthouse in 2021, I died at 34. I did not. And the people who needed to know that I did not have now had the opportunity to understand it in terms that cannot be appealed. There is something I want to add, something that happened after the plea agreements were finalized that I have not told anyone outside of my closest friends in David's office. About 3 weeks after the sentencing, I received a letter. Not from my mother, not from Marcus or Diane. From Derek, my ex-husband. The letter was 3 pages. I am not going to reproduce it in detail because some of it was personal in ways that belong only to me. But the relevant part, the part that changed my understanding of the full picture, was a section near the end in which Derek described a conversation he had had with Marcus in the fall of 2021. Marcus had called him approximately 2 months after I stopped contact. Derek said Marcus had told him in the course of that conversation that the family believed I had gone off somewhere to make a point and would come back when I was ready, but that in the meantime there were practical matters to consider. Derek said he had not understood what Marcus meant at the time and had not asked. He said that after reading about the federal case in the news, the charges had generated a brief local news story that had been picked up in regional outlets. He had understood. He said he thought I should know that he had not been involved in any way and had not known what the practical matters Marcus had referenced actually were. He also said, and this is the part I have sat with longest, that he was sorry. Not for the divorce, not for the things that had happened between us, but for having maintained a relationship with my family after our marriage ended in a way that had, he now understood, given them information about my habits and whereabouts and financial situation that they had used in constructing their claim. He had not known that was what his conversations with Marcus were for. But he understood now that his presence in their lives after our divorce had been useful to them in ways he had not examined. I read that letter twice and then put it in a folder with the rest of the documentation from the case. I did not respond to Derek. I don't intend to. But I thought about the letter for a long time afterward, and what I thought about most was the word useful. Useful, my family had found a way to make everything useful. My disappearance useful. Derek's residual connection to them useful. My Oregon driver's license, ironically, had also proven useful just in the opposite direction. What they had not found useful was the truth. The truth that I was alive, that I had simply stopped calling, that a person's decision to withdraw from a painful family situation was not the same as dying, had not served any purpose they recognized. So they had constructed a different truth, a more useful one. The decision to construct a more useful truth. The moment in which someone looks at a situation and decides that what is real is less valuable than what would be convenient, and then takes steps to make the convenient thing real by putting it on paper. I have worked in medical billing for 4 years. I process documentation every day. I understand, perhaps better than most people, how much of what we treat as settled fact is simply a document that someone created. My death was a document someone created. The document that proved otherwise was a driver's license I had gotten 3 days before the date on the death certificate, and a lease signed before that, and 2 years of bank statements and tax returns and employment records, the ordinary accumulating evidence of an ordinary life lived continuously, without interruption, without the gap that would be required for the death the document described. I was alive in every piece of paper. That is not nothing. In fact, it is everything. Helen Park, the insurance investigator who made the first call, retired 6 months after my case closed. She sent me a note through David's office that said simply that mine had been the most unusual case of her 30-year career and that she was glad the audit had caught it. I sent her back a card that said thank you for doing your job. I meant it the way I mean most things now, completely, without irony, with the particular gratitude of someone who understands that a single phone call from a person doing their job correctly can change the entire trajectory of what a life looks like. My life looked, for almost 2 years, like something that had ended. It hadn't. I am 37 years old and I am alive in every document that matters, and I live in Portland, where the rain comes in sideways in November and the coffee is very good and no one knows my family or what they decided about me in a room I was not in. That is enough. That is, in fact, more than enough.